The parking lot buzzed with nervous energy as families adjusted their best clothes and checked their phones one last time. Graduation day at Fort Carson carried weight that civilian ceremonies never could. These weren't kids getting diplomas. These were young men and women who had survived months of being broken down and rebuilt into something harder, something ready for what the world might demand of them. I smoothed my simple gray dress and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. That had always been my approach to family gatherings. Blend in, stay quiet, let the spotlight find someone else. Today, that someone was my brother, Marcus. Dad strutted across the asphalt like he owned the entire military installation. His chest puffed out, shoulders back, chin lifted at that particular angle he used when he wanted everyone to know he belonged somewhere. Mom walked a half step behind him, clutching her purse with both hands. Her smile stretched tight across her face like plastic wrap over a bowl. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who had never served a day in uniform, acting like he had personally trained every soldier on that base. But that was Dad. He collected reflected glory the way some people collected stamps, carefully arranging other people's achievements into a display case he could show off to neighbors. We found seats in the metal bleachers that had been baking under the Colorado sun since dawn. The heat radiated up through the aluminum, making everyone shift uncomfortably. Dad immediately began his performance, greeting strangers like old friends, shaking hands with other fathers, comparing notes about whose kid had excelled where. "My boy, Marcus, finished in the top 10%, he announced to anyone within earshot. His voice carried that particular blend of pride and authority he used when discussing things he considered important. Natural leader, always has been. Some kids are just built different, you know. I sat quietly on his other side, watching him work the crowd. This was his element. This was where Dad felt most alive, basking in the accomplishments of someone who shared his last name. It didn't matter that Marcus had done all the work, endured all the pain, earned every stripe and ribbon through his own sweat and determination. In Dad's mind, success was a family affair, and he was the patriarch collecting dividends on his investment. The ceremony began with precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. Soldiers moved in formation across the parade ground, their boots hitting the dirt in perfect synchronization. The American flag snapped in the mountain breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a bugle played with the kind of clarity that made your chest tighten. Marcus looked different in his dress blues, older somehow. The boy who used to leave his socks on the kitchen floor had been replaced by someone who understood the weight of responsibility. His posture was ramrod straight, his expression focused, but calm. Whatever they had put him through in those months of training had worked. Dad leaned forward in his seat, phone already recording, muttering commentary like he was providing color analysis for a sporting event. "Look at that bearing. Look at that discipline. That's my DNA right there." I wanted to point out that discipline was something you developed through practice and determination, not something you inherited through bloodline. But I had learned years ago that contradicting Dad during his moments of triumph was like stepping into a hornet's nest. Better to let him have his moment and avoid the inevitable argument that would follow. The commanding officer took the podium, his voice booming across the assembled crowd through speakers that crackled with static. He spoke about service and sacrifice, about the privilege of wearing the uniform, about the trust that American citizens placed in the men and women who chose to defend their freedoms. Standard graduation speech material, but delivered with the kind of conviction that made you believe every word. This wasn't some principal reading from prepared remarks at a high school ceremony. This was a career soldier who had earned the right to speak about what service meant. When they began calling names, the energy in the crowd shifted. Parents straightened in their seats, cameras came up, and conversations died down to whispers. Each name represented months of struggle, of pushing past limits they didn't know they had, of choosing to continue when everything inside them screamed to quit. Marcus David Thompson. Dad exploded from his seat like he had been launched from a catapult. His applause thundered across the bleachers, drowning out the polite clapping from other families. He whistled through his teeth. the sharp piercing sound he usually reserved for calling the dog. Mom smiled and clapped more gently, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to let fall. I applauded too, genuinely proud of my brother. Marcus had always been the athlete in the family, the one who pushed himself harder than anyone else expected. Seeing him succeed at something this challenging felt right, felt earned. After the ceremony, families flooded onto the parade ground for photos and congratulations. Dad immediately commandeered Marcus, positioning him for pictures, adjusting his uniform, treating him like a trophy that needed proper display. Other fathers approached to shake Marcus's hand and exchange pleasantries about the training, the base, the bright future ahead. That's when Dad really hit his stride. "You know, military service runs in our family," he told a group of parents who had gathered nearby. His voice carried that tone of authority he used when dispensing wisdom to people he considered his intellectual inferiors. "My father served in Korea, instilled those values in me, and I passed them down to my kids." He gestured toward Marcus, who was accepting congratulations from his drill instructor. "Natural-born leader, that one. Got the warrior gene. Some families just breed that kind of excellence." Then his gaze shifted to me, and something changed in his expression. The pride dimmed, replaced by something that looked almost like disappointment. "Now my daughter here, she tried the military route a few years back. Didn't quite work out the way we hoped." The words hit like a slap across the face. Sudden, sharp, designed to sting. "Couldn't handle the pressure," he continued, shaking his head with the kind of theatrical sadness he used when discussing personal failures. "Washed out during basic training. Some people just aren't cut out for that kind of discipline." The group of parents nodded sympathetically, their expressions shifting from polite interest to awkward discomfort. Nobody wanted to be part of this conversation, but Dad seemed oblivious to their discomfort. "She's doing fine now," he added, as if he were providing a medical update on a patient with a chronic condition. "Found work that's more suited to her temperament. Can't all be warriors, right?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks, a familiar burning sensation that I had learned to recognize as the physical manifestation of public humiliation. This wasn't the first time Dad had used my supposed failure as a conversation starter, as a way to make Marcus's success shine brighter by comparison. The difference was that, this time, we weren't at a neighborhood barbecue or a church social. We were on a military base, surrounded by people who understood what service actually meant. And Dad was painting me as someone who had quit, someone who had taken the easy way out when things got difficult. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to defend myself, or at least change the subject. But before I could speak, a voice cut through the conversation like a blade through silk. "Excuse me, sir." We all turned toward the voice. A drill sergeant approached our group, his uniform immaculate, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that made civilians instinctively straighten their shoulders. He was older than most of the instructors I had seen that day, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent molding recruits into soldiers. Dad immediately shifted into his deferential mode, the one he used when talking to people whose authority he couldn't question or diminish. "Sergeant, wonderful ceremony today. My son Marcus just graduated, top 10% of his class." The drill sergeant nodded politely, but his attention wasn't on Dad. His eyes had fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. There was something in his gaze, a recognition that I couldn't quite place. He stepped closer, his head tilted slightly as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. The conversation around us died away as other parents sensed the shift in atmosphere. Even Dad fell silent, uncertain about what was happening. The sergeant's eyes never left my face as he spoke again, his voice quieter now but somehow more commanding than when he had addressed the entire group. "Ma'am, forgive me for asking, but what's your name?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a spent cartridge. Simple words that somehow carried the weight of years, of secrets, of truths that had been buried so deep I had almost forgotten they existed. I met his gaze steadily. my voice calm despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Sarah Thompson. He stared at me for another long moment, and I watched as understanding dawned across his features like sunrise breaking over a mountain ridge. His expression shifted from curiosity to recognition to something that looked almost like awe. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every person in our little circle heard every word with perfect clarity. My God, you're the ghost of Kandahar, Dahar. The silence that followed those words was different from any quiet I had ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something enormous, something that changed the molecular structure of the air itself. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter died in throats. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Dad's mouth fell open, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. The other parents took an unconscious step backward, as if the drill sergeant had just announced I was carrying a contagious disease. Mom's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with the kind of shock you see in people who have just witnessed a car accident. Marcus pushed through the crowd that had gathered, his dress blues still crisp despite the heat. He stopped next to Dad, his gaze moving between me and the drill sergeant like he was watching a tennis match played in a language he didn't speak. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, but his voice sounded smaller than it had moments before. The drill sergeant never took his eyes off me. "Ma'am, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Second deployment was Kandahar Province, 2018 to 2019. His voice carried the weight of memory, of nights that stretched too long and days that came too fast. We heard stories about a civilian contractor who moved through the mountains like smoke, someone who could track insurgent movement patterns, predict ambush locations, save convoys before they knew they needed saving." He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully, walking the line between what he could say and what had to remain buried. "They called you the ghost because nobody ever saw you coming. But we all felt the difference when you were there. Casualties dropped by 60% in sectors where you operated. Supply routes that had been death traps for months suddenly became safe passage." Dad's face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken dam. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Sarah works in an office. She pushes paperwork. She never served overseas." The sergeant's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. The look of a professional soldier who had just heard a civilian make a statement about military operations they couldn't possibly understand. "Sir, with respect, civilian contractors don't wear uniforms. They don't march in parades. They don't get medals pinned to their chests in front of cameras." His tone remained respectful, but there was steel underneath the courtesy. They do the work that keeps soldiers alive, and they do it in places where being seen means being dead. Marcus stepped closer to me, his voice barely audible. "Sarah, is this true?" I looked at my little brother, this man who had just graduated from basic training, who thought he understood what service meant. His eyes held the same expression I had seen on young soldiers' faces when they realized the war was bigger and darker and more complicated than anything they had imagined. "Some things can't be talked about, Marcus," I said quietly. "Some work happens in the spaces between what people know and what they need to know." Dad found his voice again, but it cracked like a teenager's. "This is ridiculous. Sarah dropped out of basic training. She couldn't handle the physical demands. She came home after 3 weeks because she wasn't strong enough." The drill sergeant turned to face Dad directly, and something in his posture shifted. Not aggressive, but absolutely final. "Sir, I don't know what story you've been telling yourself, but I know what I saw in theater. I know the briefings we received. I know the lives that were saved." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, the kind that soldiers carry to prove their membership in elite units. The metal caught the afternoon sunlight as he held it up. "This coin was given to me by my commanding officer after a mission in the Arghandab Valley. We were supposed to lose half our convoy that day. Intelligence said the road was compromised, the route was a kill zone. We should expect heavy casualties. He looked back at me. Instead, we drove through clean. Not a shot fired. Not a single IED detonated. Our CO told us later that someone had been out there for 3 days, mapping insurgent positions, marking safe passage routes, clearing obstacles we never saw. The coin disappeared back into his pocket. That someone saved 23 American lives that day. And according to the after-action report, it was a civilian contractor operating under the call sign Ghost. Mom made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. Her hand reached out toward me, then stopped, like she was afraid I might disappear if she touched me. "But why didn't you tell us?" she whispered. "All these years we thought you had failed. We thought you couldn't handle military life." I felt something crack inside my chest. Not breaking, but shifting, like ice that had been frozen too long finally starting to thaw. Because the work required invisibility. Because people who do that kind of job stay alive by staying unknown. Because sometimes protecting the people you love means letting them believe a story that hurts less than the truth. Dad shook his head violently, as if physical motion could dislodge the reality that was reshaping itself around him. No, this doesn't make sense. Sarah was never deployed. She never went through advanced training. She works for some government agency doing data analysis. Data analysis, the drill sergeant repeated, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. Yes, sir. Pattern recognition, behavioral prediction, movement tracking, all very technical terms for keeping soldiers breathing. More people had gathered now, drawn by the intensity of the conversation. Other drill instructors, officers, families who sensed they were witnessing something significant. The circle around us had grown, but somehow the space felt smaller, more intimate. A lieutenant colonel approached, his rank insignia catching my attention before his face registered. "Sergeant, what's the situation here?" The drill sergeant snapped to attention. "Sir, just recognizing someone who served with distinction in theater. Wanted to pay my respects." The lieutenant colonel's eyes found mine, and I saw the moment when recognition hit him too. His expression went through the same progression, confusion, realization, something approaching reverence. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried the weight of formal acknowledgement. "It's an honor." Dad looked between the lieutenant colonel and the drill sergeant, his world reshaping itself in real time. "I don't understand. How do you both know her? What am I missing here?" The lieutenant colonel chose his words with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating the boundary between classified information and public discourse. "Sir, there are aspects of modern military operations that don't appear in newspapers or graduation speeches. There are people who serve in ways that can't be acknowledged publicly, who take risks that can't be measured by conventional standards." He paused, glancing at me with something that looked like respect. "Your daughter's work in Afghanistan saved American lives. That's not classified information. That's documented fact." Marcus was staring at me like he was seeing a ghost, like the sister he thought he knew had been replaced by someone entirely different. "Sarah, why didn't you ever say anything? All this time, you let Dad think you were a failure. You let all of us think you couldn't cut it." The question hung between us, heavy with years of misunderstanding, of family dinners where I had been the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you bit off more than you could chew. "Because the mission was more important than my reputation," I said, simply. "Because keeping you safe was more important than keeping you proud. Because some sacrifices happen in silence, and the people who make them don't get to choose how the story gets told." Dad was quiet now, his bluster deflated, his certainty cracked. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the realization that his version of events had been built on foundations that had never existed. "I need to sit down," he said, and his voice sounded older than it had that morning. The drill sergeant stepped forward one final time, his attention focused entirely on me. "Ma'am, I know you can't talk about details. I know there are things that have to stay buried. But I want you to know that there are soldiers walking around today because of work you did in places most people can't pronounce. That matters. That will always matter." He saluted then, sharp and clean and final. Not the casual acknowledgement he might give to a visiting dignitary, but the crisp recognition reserved for someone who had earned respect through blood and sacrifice and choices made in the dark. I returned the salute, muscle memory taking over, my hand moving with the precision that had been drilled into me in places that didn't officially exist. Around us, the graduation celebration continued, but our little corner of the world had been transformed into something else entirely: a reckoning, a revelation, a moment when the truth finally stepped out of the shadows and demanded to be seen. The salute lingered in the air between us, a bridge spanning years of silence and misunderstanding. When I finally lowered my hand, the weight of secrets I'd carried for so long felt different somehow, not lighter, but shared. The burden distributed among witnesses who understood what service actually meant. Dad remained frozen in place, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. The confident patriarch who had dominated every family gathering, who had spent years defining my worth through his own narrow lens, looked lost. His hands opened and closed at his sides, grasping for something solid in a reality that had shifted beneath his feet. "I don't understand," he said again, but quieter this time. The bluster was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost vulnerable. "If this is true, if you really did all this, why let me think you were a quitter? Why let me tell people you couldn't handle military life?" The question cut deeper than his earlier mockery had. There was genuine pain in his voice now, the confusion of a man realizing he'd been living inside a story that had never been true. I looked at him, this man who had shaped so much of my childhood, who had taught me to stand up straight and speak clearly and never back down from a challenge. The same man who had spent years tearing me down because I hadn't met his expectations for what success should look like. "Because the alternative was worse," I said simply. "Because keeping operational security meant protecting everyone I cared about. Because sometimes love looks like letting people believe you're weak when the truth would put them in danger." Mom stepped forward then, her face streaked with tears she hadn't tried to hide. "All those years," she whispered, "all those family dinners where your father would compare you to Marcus. All those times I watched you sit quietly while he talked about your failures." Her voice broke. "Oh, honey, what we put you through." The drill sergeant cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, if I may, the kind of work your daughter did, it requires a special type of person. Someone who can disappear when they need to. Someone who can carry secrets that would break most people. Someone who can sacrifice their own recognition for the greater mission." He gestured toward the families still celebrating around us, parents taking photos with their newly graduated soldiers. "These folks get to be proud publicly. They get to wear their pride like a badge, tell everyone about their hero children. But the people who do the deepest work, they don't get that luxury. Their heroism lives in the shadows." Marcus had been quiet through this exchange, but now he stepped closer to me. His dress blues were still perfect, his bearing still crisp, but his eyes held something I'd never seen before. Respect, maybe, or recognition of something he was only beginning to understand. "Sarah," he said carefully, "when you came to my graduation, were you here just as my sister, or was there another reason?" The question was smarter than I'd expected from him. Marcus had always been physical, athletic, the kind of person who solved problems with effort and determination. But military training had sharpened his mind along with his body. I glanced around the circle of people listening to our conversation. Officers, enlisted personnel, families. Too many ears for certain truths, but some things could be acknowledged without compromising anything vital. "Let's just say that when someone with my background shows up at a military graduation, it's usually not a coincidence," I said. "Quality control is important in any operation. The lieutenant colonel nodded slowly. "Assessment and evaluation," he said, choosing his words with the same care I had. "Making sure standards are being maintained, making sure the next generation is ready for what they might face." Dad's face had gone white again. "You were here on assignment? You were evaluating Marcus's unit?" "I was here as your daughter," I said firmly. "Everything else is secondary." But the damage was done. Dad could see the implications spreading out like ripples in a pond. His daughter, the one he'd dismissed as a failure, had been sent to evaluate the program that had trained his son. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. "Sir," the drill sergeant said, addressing Dad directly, "I hope you understand now why your daughter couldn't tell you the truth. The kind of work she did, it only works if people like you and me don't know about it. The moment it becomes public, it becomes useless." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your daughter sacrificed her own reputation to keep doing work that saved lives. That takes a special kind of courage. The kind that doesn't need recognition to keep going." A younger soldier approached our group, hesitant but determined. He couldn't have been more than 22, fresh-faced and earnest in the way that reminded me why the work mattered. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, addressing me directly. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing." He swallowed hard, gathering courage. "My older brother served in Afghanistan in 2019. He was in a convoy that got hit by an IED near Kandahar. Lost his leg, but he lived." The young soldier's voice grew stronger as he continued. "He told me there was someone working in that sector, someone the locals called a ghost. Said whoever it was had warned them about 3 different ambush sites that week. Said if it wasn't for the intelligence that Ghost provided, half his unit would have come home in boxes." He looked directly at me, his eyes bright with something that might have been gratitude or awe. "Was that you?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with meaning and consequence. I felt the weight of every person listening, felt the pull of recognition I'd spent years avoiding. "There were a lot of people doing important work in that theater," I said carefully. "Your brother's survival is what matters, not who gets credit for helping make it happen." But the young soldier wasn't satisfied with diplomatic deflection. "Ma'am, with respect, my brother said the ghost saved his convoy on September 15th. He said intelligence came through about IED placement that was so specific, so accurate, it had to come from someone who had eyes on the target." September 15th. I remembered that day with crystalline clarity. 3 weeks of surveillance, mapping insurgent movement patterns, tracking weapons caches, sleeping in a spider hole for 72 hours, living on energy bars and water purification tablets, watching through high-powered optics as explosive devices were buried in the road that American vehicles would travel at dawn. "I remember that convoy," I said quietly. 23 soldiers. Route clearance was compromised. Alternative path required 12 hours of advance reconnaissance. The young soldier's breath caught. "That was you." Around us, more people had stopped their conversations to listen. Word was spreading through the crowd in the way that significant news always travels, person to person, whisper to whisper, until everyone knows something important has happened even if they don't understand what. An older woman approached, wearing the kind of dress that said she was someone's grandmother, someone who had spent decades worrying about soldiers she loved. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes fixed on my face. "My grandson served 3 tours in Afghanistan," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years spent praying over deployment schedules. "He came home different, quieter but alive." She paused, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "He told me there were angels over there, people who kept watch in places where angels weren't supposed to be able to survive." She reached out and took my hand, her fingers soft but strong. "I don't know if you're one of those angels, but if you are, I want you to know that a grandmother in Colorado says thank you every night in her prayers." The simplicity of her gratitude hit harder than any medal ceremony could have. This wasn't about recognition or validation or setting the record straight with my family. This was about the reason the work existed in the first place. The grandmothers who got to keep their grandsons, the parents who didn't have to bury their children, the wives who didn't become widows. Dad was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The daughter he thought he knew had been replaced by someone he couldn't categorize, couldn't diminish, couldn't reduce to simple failure or success. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How long were you over there?" 3 years, I said. "Multiple deployments, different sectors." "And you never told us. You let us think you were working some desk job, filing reports, answering phones." "Because that was safer for everyone," I said. "Because the people I was tracking, they had ways of finding leverage. They had ways of reaching into America, into communities, into families. They had ways of making people pay for interfering with their operations." The weight of that truth settled over our little group like a blanket. Dad's face went through another series of changes as he processed what I was really saying. His daughter hadn't just been overseas doing dangerous work. She had been doing work that made enemies. Enemies who might have looked for ways to strike back. "You kept us safe by staying invisible," Mom said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You protected us by letting us believe you were ordinary." "There's nothing ordinary about sacrifice," the drill sergeant said firmly. "Nothing ordinary about choosing mission success over personal recognition. Nothing ordinary about carrying that weight in silence." Marcus stepped closer to me, and I could see him trying to reconcile the sister he'd grown up with and the person he was discovering she had always been. "All those times Dad compared me to you," he said slowly. "All those times he said I was the strong one, the disciplined one, the one who could handle pressure." He shook his head. "I was following in footsteps I didn't even know existed." The crowd around us had grown larger, but somehow the conversation felt more intimate. Other families were gathering at the edges, drawn by the intensity of what was happening, but respectful enough to maintain distance. A colonel approached, his uniform bearing ribbons I recognized from classified briefings. He moved with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what kind of conversation he was walking into. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me with the formal courtesy reserved for people whose service couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but privately commanded absolute respect. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but your work in the Kandahar sector was legendary among operational commanders." He turned to include Dad in his next words. "Sir, I hope you understand that what your daughter accomplished overseas represents the highest level of service this country can ask of its people. The kind of work that doesn't get written about in newspapers because success depends on staying invisible." Dad nodded slowly, but I could see he was still struggling to process everything. The man who had spent years defining strength through visible achievement, through public recognition, through awards that could be hung on walls, was being forced to confront a different kind of excellence entirely. "I need to understand something," Dad said, looking directly at me. "If you were doing all this, if you were saving lives and preventing attacks and doing this incredible work, why did you let me humiliate you? Why did you sit through all those family gatherings and let me tear you down?" The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we were ready to cross. Because answering it honestly meant acknowledging years of pain that had built up like sediment in a river. It meant talking about the cost of silence, the price of protection, the weight of choosing mission over family harmony. Because sometimes keeping people safe means letting them hurt you, I said simply. Because sometimes love looks like taking the blame for things that aren't your fault. Because sometimes the person who can carry the weight is the one who has to carry it, even when nobody understands why. Ends why. The words settled over the gathering like dust after an explosion. Dad stood there, his mouth working silently, trying to form responses to revelations that had no easy answers. The confident man who had dominated the morning with his boasts about warrior genes and family legacy looked suddenly fragile, like someone had pulled the foundation out from under everything he thought he knew. 23 soldiers, he repeated quietly, his voice hollow. You saved 23 soldiers in one day. That was just one convoy, the colonel said gently. One mission out of hundreds. The kind of work your daughter did, it ripples outward in ways we'll never fully measure. Intelligence gathered in one sector prevents attacks in 3 others. Patterns identified in one region save lives across an entire theater of operations. Mom reached for my arm, her fingers trembling as they found my sleeve. All those nights I worried about you when you were overseas. All those times you called and said you were fine, that you were safe behind a desk somewhere. Her voice cracked. You were never behind a desk, were you? I looked at this woman who had raised me, who had packed care packages full of cookies and magazines, and sent them to addresses that didn't exist, to cover stories that had never been true. I was as safe as anyone could be doing that kind of work, I said. The training was extensive. The support was professional. The risks were calculated. Calculated, Dad said, and something bitter crept into his voice. You were calculating risks that could have gotten you killed, and we didn't even know you were in danger. The drill sergeant shifted slightly, his attention focused on Dad with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what kind of mental adjustment was happening. Sir, with respect, that's exactly why the security protocols exist. The people who love operators can't protect them by worrying. They protect them by living normal lives, by being the stable foundation that gives operators something worth coming home to. He paused, choosing his words with military precision. Your daughter couldn't afford to have you lying awake at night, wondering if she was safe. She couldn't afford to have you asking questions that might lead to conversations that might compromise operational security. She protected her mission by protecting your ignorance. The brutality of that truth hit Dad like a physical blow. I watched him process the idea that his ignorance had been a gift, that his daughter's deception had been an act of love disguised as failure. Marcus stepped forward, his dress blues catching the afternoon sunlight. Sarah, when you came home between deployments, when you sat at those family dinners and listened to Dad compare us, what was that like? What was it like knowing what you had really been doing? The question cut deeper than any of the others because it touched the part of this experience that had cost me the most. Not the physical dangers of the work, not the psychological strain of operating in hostile territory, but the emotional toll of watching my family construct a narrative about my life that painted me as weak when I had never felt stronger. It was necessary, I said simply. The mission required it. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with operational language. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking about you as a person. What was it like sitting at our kitchen table listening to Dad tell stories about your failures when you knew you had just spent months saving American lives? I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of muscles that had been clenched tight for years. It was lonely, I said quietly. It was the loneliest thing I've ever experienced, but loneliness was a small price to pay for keeping you all safe. The young soldier who had asked about his brother stepped closer, his eyes bright with understanding. That seemed beyond his years. Ma'am, my brother told me something else about Afghanistan. He said the hardest part wasn't the combat or the heat or the separation from family. He said the hardest part was coming home and not being able to tell people what really happened over there. The sun was setting behind the mountains as the crowd began to thin. Families drifting back to their cars with graduation programs clutched in their hands and new understanding weighing on their hearts. Dad stood quietly beside me, his earlier bluster replaced by something I had never seen before, humility mixed with a pride he was only beginning to comprehend. I owe you an apology, he said finally, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the respect I should have given you all along. Sometimes the truth doesn't roar onto the scene with fanfare and celebration. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried in the words of a drill sergeant who recognizes sacrifice when he sees it. Sometimes it takes a graduation ceremony to teach a father what strength really looks like, and sometimes the greatest victories happen in shadows where no one can see them. That day taught me that silence isn't always weakness, and recognition isn't always necessary for service to matter. The real heroes often walk among us unrecognized, carrying burdens we can't imagine, protecting freedoms we take for granted, and sometimes, just sometimes, the truth finds its way into the light where it belongs.